as promised, for whatever reason, I went ahead and dug up this old report that I wrote while I was in college. Interestingly enough, I was in business college. I believe I graduated business college in 2002. Well, I didn't graduate. I got a 4-year degree, so I guess that's not really a graduate. Anyway, one of the things I did is I wrote a paper called "The Dope on the Drug War," and this was in economics class. So, clear a spot here so I can throw these pages down. And I'm just going to get right into it. And I don't think I'm really going to comment on it, but I will say beforehand that, sure, I wrote this, and I would say it was either in 1999 or 2000, maybe 2002 at the very latest, but I doubt that. And so the numbers, there could be some updated numbers if you wanted to, but really the story is much the same. And the history is definitely the same. So we're going to go. In the following, I'll give you the names of the little sections and stuff. This one's overview. In the following report, a correlative viewpoint of the war on drugs will show a fragmented look at some of the economics behind all of the capital expenditures put towards the prohibition effort. To illustrate the current war on drugs, history of the drug epidemic, and its economical persuasions to exist are given from the early drug wars, the Opium Wars. After exploring the drug war's roots, the current situation is expounded upon using several economic profiles. The report couldn't possibly explore all economic questions raised by these issues, so its purpose is to place things into a clear perspective so that a more complete understanding of the economic impact of drugs can be realized. A brief history on the war against drugs. To begin this economic analysis, I would like to share a quote from the Executive Director of the United Nations International Drug Control Program, UNDCP, Giorgio Giacomelli. Quote, "The social and economic cost of drug abuse place an intolerable strain on the social infrastructure of developed and developing countries alike. The illicit production of drugs diverts human and natural resources for more productive activities and weakens the foundation for long-term economic growth." That was in 1997 that was said by that guy. After reading such a statement, one would think that we are on the threshold of another Black Plague or Great Depression. On one side, there seems to be a new expansion of worldwide anti-drug initiatives aimed at stopping this menace. On the other side, however, the history of drugs in society, from ancient Incas' use of coca leaves to opiate use that predates most written history. On this end, there is a pattern of wars related to drugs that begins in the 19th century. The first drug wars were not fought in the effort to eradicate illicit drugs and help addicts get over their addictions. The first wars, known as the Opium Wars, took place in China between China and Great Britain. It wasn't because Britain was trying to thwart the production of opiates like a lot of people in modern times believe, but quite to the contrary. In 1840, the Chinese emperor tried to restrict British trading companies, such as the East India Company, founded by Marco Polo, due to the serious problems relating to the opium addiction. The trading companies were shipping massive quantities of opium to China, including whatever byproducts could be derived after manufacturing their own opiate synthetics, such as laudanum, a cure-all preparation of the time that was used very heavily all over Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. Great Britain's response to the trade restrictions was to go to war. China's weakened drug-addicted population proved easy for the British to dominate. In 1842, the First Opium War ended with the Treaty of Nanking, which immediately made the British Crown $21 million in silver, full control over China's ports, and extraterritorial control over the free port of Hong Kong, which is said to still be, to this very day, Britain's capital of its global drug-running efforts. Now remember, when I say to this day or modern or whatever, this was written in like 2000, at the very, right around 2000, we'll say, just to make it simple. So this was written about 17 years ago. All right, the Second Opium War took place just a few years later, from 1858 to 1860. This war had a larger aim than the first one. After it was over, Britain had succeeded in the following. The British trading companies and merchant banks set up the Hong Kong and Shanghai Corporation, which is a unique system for trafficking drugs and laundering money. It is said that these companies are still the foremost authorities in these black market dealings, especially when talking about the heroin trade. Now, that is definitely not the case anymore, because I do believe that we took over the heroin trade, didn't we, with Afghanistan, right after I wrote this paper, pretty much. So Britain's economics were simple. Buy opium from poor farmers in countries in Southeast and Southwest Asia and sell it to China at a profitable level, just high enough so that just about anyone could become an addict after casually using it from time to time. Spread addiction throughout the Empire of China, where there was a potential for millions of clients or addicts. When the Chinese government protested, Britain invaded them. By conquering China, they could then draw up guidelines outlining heavier shipments to China and more free use of China as a port to other trade areas. The First Opium War achieved that, and in essence, the Second Opium War was Britain's way of putting their flag in China's soil, as to say to the rest of the world, this is our playground. The Second War ended with the Treaty of Taint-Sin. This gave Britain control of 7/8 of the vastly expanded trade of opium into China. This brought in £20 million in 1864. The increased the total number of opium shipments from 58,508 chests in 1860 to 105,508 chests in 1880. The war against drugs in America marked the first trend in trying to enact a prohibition stance against drugs. The earliest accounts began in the early 20th century when Coca-Cola still contained the original ingredient, cocaine, and Bayer Laboratories was openly distributing heroin as cough suppressant to physicians around the world. During this era, it was legal for anyone to manufacture and distribute patent medicine. Patent medicines were preparations that contained either opiates or cocaine derivatives, for the most part, and whatever other ingredients the makers of the medicine decided to include. Several publications began criticizing patent medicines and self-treatment during the turn of the century. In response, the American Medical Association began investigating patent medicines. Beginning in 1905, Samuel Hopkins Adams began writing The Great American Fraud, a long series of articles that attacked patent medicines in the national weekly magazine Collier's. In his opening essay, he indicated the economic force behind patent medicines, saying that, quote, gullible America will spend this year $75 million in the purchase of patent medicines. This led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, prohibiting the transfer from state to state adulterated or misbranded food or drugs. This caused a decline in the patent medicine industry because they had then had to put the ingredients on the label. This in itself was by no means a prohibition against the drugs themselves. This began a decade later with the passing of the Harrison Act of 1914. New York Representative Francis Burton Harrison penned this bill that required all importers, manufacturers, and distributors of cocaine and opiate drugs to register with the Treasury Department, pay social taxes, and keep records of all transactions. The law also granted physicians the right to prescribe, dispense, and administer narcotics to patients for legitimate medical purposes, and in the course of professional practice. In 1919, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it was not legal to prescribe narcotics to an addict for the purpose of maintaining their use or comfort in the case of Webb versus the U.S. So, see, I made a video earlier about how, could a lawsuit decision affect how we do policy? Yeah, it really can. So this was a turning point for the drug war, as it was now called. One of the significant results of the Harrison Act was to make drug trafficking essentially illegal. By the 1920s, doctors were afraid to treat drug addicts for any reason, thus creating an illegal underground industry practically overnight. The demand for opiates was especially high in America, where everyone was used to being prescribed heroin for sore throats and chest colds. In 1924, the U.S. Public Health Service carefully examined all available survey on drug use and estimated that there was about 110,000 drug addicts in the United States at the end of 1922, reflecting a considerable decline since the turn of the century. During the eras following the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, cocaine use went underground for many years and was ignored by the government crackdowns on drug law offenders. The next drug that the U.S. government focused on in their drug war was cannabis. Cannabis use has heavy roots in American culture throughout history, as its roots are deep and old on a worldwide scale. References to marijuana appear in early Hindu, Greek, Arab, and Chinese writings. Economically speaking, hemp, the plant that cannabis derives from, used to be most southern states' number one cash crop due to the demand for it in the sailing industry. Hemp's economic value dropped steadily at the turn of the 20th century. By the 1920s, marijuana had become a visible drug of choice among minority groups in the South and Southwest. This was at a time in which an anti-alcohol movement was also building up, calling for a nationwide prohibition on alcohol. Throughout the 1930s, states began enacting anti-marijuana laws in ways that modern cities call flat-out racism. Modern critics, rather. What was even more racist about these laws was that they were the go-ahead for a flood of racial propaganda that made marijuana out to be an evil substance that caused men of color, I would say, to rape, thieve, and murder. As a result of these campaigns, the Marijuana Tax Act was signed into law in 1937, placing marijuana in the same category as the Harrison Act placed coca products and opiates. And yes, 1937, that sounds like the same, there's a 7 at the end. So what was that? That was 80 years ago. This law also had a two-pronged effect on the U.S. economy. First, it made it impossible for producers of hemp, still a major crop in Tennessee, Kentucky, and California at the time, to make a profit from hemp production due to an unfounded high tax on their product, hemp. Unfortunately for the farmers, this was a stray bullet because hemp contains none of the properties of cannabis and has no value as a consumable drug. The second effect of this law was to create another black market under the guise of the drug trafficking underworld. The marijuana black market had all the characteristics of the opiate and coca trade, except violent crimes, which is due to a lack of enormous profits in the marijuana trade and the fact that marijuana addicts have never been truly known to resort to violence or larceny or obtain money for more cannabis. And I believe the word addicts is in quotes there. Narcotics addiction all but disappeared by the early 1940s when World War II cut off the supply of opiates to the U.S. and the government propaganda against marijuana was faring good at the time, although the government encouraged farmers to grow as much hemp as possible to help in our own war efforts. During the 1950s, drug use was at an all-time low, but there was other things happening on the front lines of the drug war, and the medical community new approaches in the treatment of mental illness gave way to the research and development of LSD, a chemical that causes extreme hallucinations and expanded levels of consciousness. The government had its own LSD experiments taking place across America in hopes of finding a way to use the drug in warfare and/or covert operations. During the 1960s, hallucinogens were given a heightened popularity as many forms of the drug seeped into American counterculture. Drug use was at an all-time high in every drug category and across every social boundary. By the end of the decade, the government had put bans on all hallucinogenic drugs with heavy penalties for violating these regulations. Another startling increase in drug use during the 60s can be noted by the amount of prescription medicines, both barbiturate and amphetamine, that were produced during that decade. The annual production level of barbiturates exceeded 1 million pounds. Whoa. That is, if taken all at once, is enough to kill every man, woman, and child in the country twice. The abuse of pharmacy-grade drugs heightened through the normal legal channels of doctors and pharmacies as well as the black market-based illicit drug distribution systems. The explosion of marijuana in the 60s is significant, as just about everyone in America is aware of. Marijuana use in 1960 by Americans who had used marijuana at least once was around 650,000. By the end of the decade, it was estimated at 8 million. These numbers have leveled off and have risen and fell just around the same population percentage numbers since the 1980s, with a noticeable surge in the mid to late 90s, especially among user groups between the age of 13 and 17. As this was pointed out recently, that these polls aren't really that much different than each other, but they probably also are influenced by the level of paranoia, the different level between a Republican administration and a Democratic administration, as you probably all see yourselves these days. So the government began a number of efforts to try to eradicate marijuana before it penetrated the borders of the U.S. as early as 1969. Most all of them were failures, netting small amounts of drugs usually worth about 10% or less of the cost of the operations themselves. Marijuana use continued to grow throughout the 70s, and by the end of the 70s, the estimated number of regular users was an alarming 50 million. 50 million served. America's boldest move to extend the war on drugs beyond its own border began with the Nixon administration's worldwide war on drugs, especially heroin. In this time, federal drug expenditure levels for drug abuse prevention and law enforcement were increasing from $150.2 million in 1971 to $654.8 million in 1974. Nixon's method for defending his drug war was to talk about drugs in public view, calling them a menace to society, saying that heroin addiction was a plague that affected every man, woman, and child. He claimed that the cost to society and mainly crime on the streets was roughly $18 billion per year. These estimates were found to be more than a gross exaggeration, being close to 25 times greater than all the property stolen and 25 times greater than all of the property stolen and unrecovered in 1971. The administration had a set of plans and agendas, all of which were viewed as drastic measures aimed at bringing the drug war out of the cold state that it had always been in. Instead of heating up, the result of Nixon's drug war was ultimately an increase in funding for drug research and education. The goal of the drug war that America has been participating in since the Nixon administration is to undermine and eradicate the supply and try to reduce demand that way. Supply reduction costs about 80% of overall drug war expenditures, while demand reduction still requires 40 or more percent of the same budget for everything to work as it's supposed to. So there's already not enough money. Federal drug control spending soared between 1981 and 1994. In 1995 and 96, the federal drug control budget surpassed $13 billion. In 1995, this figure was equal to 9% of the overall government's budget expenditures for that year. When social costs are figured into the cost to taxpayers, the figures become astronomical. In 1983, the social ills were costing in excess of $80 billion. The 1996 National Drug Strategy put that figure at $67 billion. These figures illustrate that the cost incurred because of drug abuse is at least 4 times greater than the cost taxpayers pay for drug control efforts. One thing that has to be taken into consideration when reviewing social costs is the fact that a lot of these costs are due to the fact that drug use is illegal in the first place. In the UK, the figures are much lower, just slightly higher than the U.S. expenditure levels in the early 70s. And this is public expenditure in the UK in U.S. dollars on drug control from 1993 to 94, $791 million. I think that's how much we spend a day. All right, so the seriousness of the situation in the U.S. is said to be much higher, and the social costs surely illustrate. Costs to society incurred by drug abuse and its many side effects are inevitably worked into the taxes on that every taxpayer must pay. I don't know about that. In a final note concerning the history of the war on drugs in America, I look at another failed system of prohibition: alcohol. In 1995, approximately $20 billion was collected in alcohol taxes on a state and federal level. The cost on society that alcohol reaped in 1995, $40 billion in direct healthcare costs, not taking a lot of other things into consideration. The next section is called Economic Pictures Painted on Dope. Understanding the economic impact drugs have on our society as well as the entire world as a whole means understanding the whole picture. Why do people use drugs? To find the answer, an economist would wonder what the utility of the drugs represented to the user. If a heroin addict felt that the utility of another shot of dope was the only thing in the world worth living for, economists would say that the drug problem is here to stay. Every aspect of the drug trade and drug war can be drawn upon economical impact analysis. The most basic of economic equations, the supply and demand, is where economic analysis truly begins. Price elasticity of demand is the percentage by which demand responds to a change in the price. If the price went up and the demand wasn't affected, then it is considered to be perfectly inelastic. So if the price of a pack of cigarettes went up 25% overnight, yet the same amount of people showed up and bought a pack of smokes, the inelasticity is perfect. If the price jump had caused a significant curve in demand, the price would be considered elastic. Sometimes price increase can have small effect on the demand. Another way elasticity occurs is when the supply is increased, the price drops, and the demand shifts. Evidence for price elasticity of cocaine and heroin are mainly theoretical or drawn up from studies of other goods. Perfect elasticity cannot exist for drugs. Research on commodities with some of those same qualities, such as alcohol and tobacco, has yielded a similar conclusion. The early theory was that because of their addictive properties, demand for drugs was pretty inelastic. This would mean that the price elasticity of heroin was at the lowest and cannabis was at the highest, the addictive nature of the drugs being the key indicator of relative inelasticity. These early theories have been abandoned with more educated and studied protocols. Using the new angles and field research data, the analysis showed that cannabis had the lowest price elasticity in its current market value, and heroin was considered high in elasticity. The National Bureau of Economical Research did a recent study into the subject and confirmed the following results. Heroin had a high price elasticity rating and was the most expensive of the drugs considered, meaning the more you charge, they'll still come, whatever. Cocaine had a medium elasticity and cannabis a very low elasticity. And that's to say that even if you raise the price, it's not going to be like dramatic increase. You're not going to have to buy, exponential amounts. Cannabis also noted as being less expensive drug considered. Calculated price elasticities for annual prevalence, i.e. change in the number of annual abusers as a result of price changes, amounted to negative 0.9 for heroin, negative 55 hundredths for cocaine, and negative 600s for cannabis. The data points to a theory and demand for these substances very strong, and it would be a serious blow if the supply of heroin or cocaine suddenly halted. When considering that the drug trade is estimated between a $300 billion and $500 billion per year industry, serious implications would uncoil if these supply lines were suddenly shut down. Throughout history, it has been argued, like the chicken and the egg, who came first, the addicts or the overabundant supply of drugs? No matter which way that argument goes, there is one thing for certain. The black market holds a large percentage of the world's cash supply. At $400 billion, the annual monies generated from the black market in 1994 from illicit drugs was roughly 8% of the United States' gross national product. That is higher than the international trade for steel and iron, automobiles, and about the same size as the total international trade in textiles. Unbelievable. Some countries depend on the illegal drug trade simply because they were conditioned to have the income, and taking away or diminishing it would have devastating rippling effects on some of these countries. For example, during the late 1990s, 10% of the labor market of Bolivia worked in the illicit drug trade. Consequently, in the same time, 10% of Bolivians' gross national product was earned in the drug industry. The sale of drugs and the laundering of profits made in the illicit drug trade account for a large underground market that is integrated into society better than any other distribution system. The USA is the largest single drug market in the world. This is figuring by reviewing consumption expenditure estimates, which indicates the U.S. citizens were estimated to have spent $48.3 billion on cocaine, heroin, and cannabis in 1993. Economists have tried to make the cost of drugs on society as fairly estimated as possible using the opportunity cost method to measure the value of different activities. This is assuming that limited resources always have alternative uses. The example given to demonstrate opportunity cost is this. The opportunity cost of an employee coming to work in an intoxicated state would be the percentage of the average daily production lost as a result of the condition. If his drug use led to an accident at work causing an injury to themselves or others, the cost to the company of health care, lost working days, and other happenings would show the cost. One of the most important socioeconomic costs stemming from drug abuse is crime. Because crime is linked to every aspect of drugs under current policies, just about every cost related controlling the supply and demand of drugs can be chalked up as a social cost of drug abuse. Costs that aren't as easy to pinpoint include replacement costs of stolen property, higher house insurance policies, and many other itemized costs that could, one way or another, be attributed to drug abuse. Today, a large percentage of the United States' rapidly growing prison population is comprised of drug offenders. From 1990 to 1994, the persons found guilty for drug offenses of all drug charges nearly doubled from 44,922 in 1990 to 86,735 in 94. Statistics show that the U.S. locks up a greater percentage of its people than any other nation except China. I don't think that's true anymore. I think we got them beat. And I think that's even by the numbers, not just percentage, which would be hard. They have a lot of people, so it would be hard to beat them on percentage, or for them to beat us, I should say. So when studying case histories on drug offenders, economic theories get put to the test. An example is 10% of federal inmates and 17% of state prison inmates said they committed their crimes in order to get money for more drugs. This takes opportunity cost to new dimensions. The economic system behind the buying and selling of illegal drugs has many components and works very efficiently as a whole, but from an individual standpoint, the drug trade can be a tough game. The risk factors for being a drug dealer on the street level of the narcotics trade are very high. Some of the implications include death, incarceration, and other risks that that a normal law-abiding citizen doesn't have to face in a working environment. Drug smuggling presents even more diverse risks than drug peddling, yet remains one of the most glamorous jobs in the drug trade. The lure of high profits from big overseas scores has been the subject of many literary works throughout the past half-century, as well as a score of films from Hollywood and small film companies worldwide. Is there any evidence that supports these claims of huge fortunes to be obtained in the smuggling trade? Individuals on the macroeconomic level resort to dealing drugs in order to maintain their habits. And in the narcotics trade, people have admitted that they resorted to committing crimes, performing sex acts, and even murdered to obtain drugs for money or money for drugs. The percentage of population that participates in the movement of drugs in one fashion or another is hard to gauge for a number of reasons. In recent years, there has been a heightened use of heroin and crack, as well as widespread abuse of LSD and ecstasy. Cannabis use in America has reached the highest use levels ever, and the spread of it and other hard drugs has reached through every social and economical culture. There is little doubt as to the demand, which has become the focus of a new worldwide effort to eradicate drugs. What this means is not clearly illustrated in the publication that outline the current issues that the world faces because of drugs. This is the World Drug Report as prepared by the United Nations International Drug Control Program, UNDCP. As the United States continues to spend a large percentage of their budgets on the drug war, the question often arises, are we getting our money's worth? Has the anti-drug effort yielded any positive results? It is certain that they have had no impact on the flow of drugs in and out of our country. Something to consider is the consumption level of drugs in the United States. All in all, most reports lead to the conclusion that the drug war is failing in all aspects of drug control under current policies. That leads to the final question: should the current drug policies be changed? To answer this, the current policies have to be revisited to determine whether or not appropriate measures have been followed through upon to achieve the desired outcomes. Does one take a hardline approach in enforcing drug laws, or should the drug laws be relaxed and actually reversed? The argument for legalizing drugs has been the focus of many economic profiles. These profiles are based on statistics drawn from countries such as Amsterdam, where the drug laws are considerably relaxed. The number one issue that always prevents serious discussion on the total legalization agenda is the possibility that there will be a serious increase in drug addiction. Likewise, total military warfare against drugs gets little support. Despite these truths, the United States has become involved with paramilitary activities in several foreign countries due to the drug production and distribution trade, including Panama, Jamaica, Mexico, and Colombia, to name a couple. And like I said, this was right before we added Afghanistan to the list. What is the risk factor of using military action to disrupt the supply and distribution chains of the illicit drug trade? This is hard to gauge because there are a lot of variables. And all it really does is it stops somebody over here from doing it, and then it lets somebody over there to do more of it. So we're down to the conclusion, and the conclusion is called Never Concluding. The conclusion of this report is that there are many socioeconomic factors that have resulted from drugs and the war against drugs. No conclusion could be made in the no conclusion could be made in the argument to end the war on drugs. The illicit drug trade has created practically impenetrable impact on the international monetary system, claiming hundreds of billions of dollars in untaxed revenues annually. The enormous flow of cash and illegal drugs circles the globe and ties many economies together in a web of money laundering and drug trafficking. Some economies actually rely on this drug market to maintain a healthy standing in the new world of free trade. Even in the United States, drug revenues from the black market account for nearly 10% of the overall gross national product. Legalization has been brought up in a number of forums throughout the political landscape, but a true legalization plan has never even been looked at by upper-level government figures. Meanwhile, drug addiction continues to be a major problem. There seems to be no economic solution for ending the drug conflict. Total legalization or limited legalization could have any number of effects, none of which are truly predictable. Continuing in the direction that the current policies are going seems to be an exercise in endurance that the anti-drug forces can never gain any ground in without total martial law being enacted. Removing the supply and demand equation has been tried and proven to be very costly, with very little to show for in the way of results. In concluding this report, I hope to further simplify the economic ramifications of the drug war. To date, the drug war continues, and the amount of money the government is willing to allocate continues to increase. And so there you have it, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. That was my report on the economics behind the drug war, but as you've seen, the title was The Dope on the Drug War. I guess I was calling the dope for a while. Who knew? I mean, I remember writing it or whatever, but I don't remember the title or the quirky little titles and the anecdotes and stuff. But I just thought I would share that because why not, you know? I've been passionately doing this since I can remember, and this is just another example. Trying to inform people about the bullshit that is the drug war.